Hello, everyone. I'm Barbara Tien with Project Kin and delighted to welcome you back to another episode of Kathy's Corner. This wonderful series has been going on the longest of all of our programs here at Project Kin, and I've often called Kathy our cornerstone to Project Kin. She's, of course, Kathy Stone, who is an acclaimed photo organizer, has for many years, and is now working on an extensive project she's had for a client that just needs a little extra work. So as we looked at what we were trying to accomplish on the topic of privacy, realized that maybe one of the most interesting things to do is to bring on a number of different voices, because privacy is one of those things like, well, we can have a whole separate conversation of what it's like, but it's one of those topics that deserves multiple perspectives, especially in the ways in which we handle it as family historians and story keepers in our families. There are so many more aspects to it than a technical question of this is how to protect the metadata, how to turn off a location or something technical like that. So for today, we have four panelists for you. I get to be one of them because I'm always so quiet on these things. Not. Um,
It could be a panelist too.
it could be. So we have two special guests and Kathy and I on your panel today. We will be walking through completely different aspects of privacy. I'm going to ask our first guest to be Linda Stufflebean. Linda Stufflebean, you may know, comes to us as a very well recognized genealogy blogger, having been blogging since 1979, if I remember correctly.
No. Researching since 79.
Of course. That would have been a giveaway from some AI answer, wouldn't it have been? Researcher, having been researching her family history since 1979 and blogging since the earliest days. And I'm going to let her tell you about that. But the important thing is the ways in which that experience has given her insights into the particular challenges of privacy in family history and specifically genealogy. Now, also joining us is Annette Gendler, who many of you will know for her active voice on Substack, and most importantly, her book, which I had here a minute ago. Thank you.
Job. Yes.
How to Write Compelling Family History Stories. And this is a book that goes into really pulling out a writer's perspective of digging in with the to tell the story aspects of a story. She's an accomplished memoirist as well, and I'll let her tell you about that as well. Finally, of course, there's a Kathy Stone, who brings in the perspective of all of those artifacts and how those artifacts tell stories that may not always be exactly what you intended to tell. You know, that word doesn't mean what you think it means when you show an artifact, for example. And finally, I'm just here as your resident nerd to step up with any questions of acronyms or other weird techno bits, because that's what I do here. Welcome, everyone. And as always, we will proceed with this recording as tightly to 1 hour as we can. We just might have a little separate sidebar afterwards at the conclusion of the program. And as always, your questions, comments, and additions are always welcome in the comments. So with that, I'm going to step away and turn it over to you, Linda.
Thank you.
Stufflebean.
Thank you, Barbara. Privacy I've found to be a very interesting issue, trying to locate living relatives of various ancestors. And I kind of look at privacy in two very different ways. I don't do a lot with DNA. I have not had any close match surprises or anything like that. That I think is an entirely different topic in terms of privacy and finding people and how you might approach them. Instead, I tend to look for old photographs, vintage photographs, where I can find descendants that are living today. I'll send those records home. Or obviously I'm looking for cousin bait, people who might be distantly related to me and want to make contact with those people. Now, the tough part in the US is trying to find young people that came of age maybe in the 1980s or 1990s. But when I hear people say, oh, I'm not on the internet, there's nothing there about me, that is totally untrue. There is so much personal information, and I'm not talking social security numbers or, you know, medical hacking or any of that stuff. If you've bought or sold a house, if you are a registered voter, there are a couple of other categories also. You end up in public databases, and there are actual companies out there, one of which I'm not going to name, but one claims to be a family history site. It's not. It's a total collection of public databases. And if you have just enough information that you can narrow down your person's age and probably where they were living, or you know a relative that maybe has a somewhat unusual name, you start looking for obituaries online, you go to this public database. Sometimes it takes maybe 10 minutes for me to find a living descendant of somebody that died in 1861. And people will say, oh, no, there's nothing out there about me. Very, very wrong. This database that I'm not naming, I'm in there, obviously, and probably all of you are not Canadians, but Americans, you're probably in there also. If you try putting your own name in and where you live, up comes my birthday. It identifies a possible spouse and the month and year when he was born, possible children when they were born, current address, current phone number, and I found that those tend to be pretty accurate unless you have somebody who moves really quickly and frequently. They're pretty accurate. Under associates, I looked at the list and I said, I don't know many of these people that they're telling me possible associates. Then I realized they're people that bought our houses in California in 1984. And they're listed in this database connected to me. So wow, from a family historian perspective, there really isn't a lot of privacy. I said between Ancestry, MyHeritage, obituaries online, public phone directories that you might find online. It's easy to make connections. And when I return these old photographs to living relatives, I never call them beforehand. I write a letter and I explain who I am, that I'm not asking for anything. I don't want them to be all creeped out. I tell them that I've been researching for decades, and this is my way of kind of thanking the genealogy community in return. And I found this photo. I said, and I explain a short version of what I just told you about how easy it is to find living people, and that's how I found you. And here's a short outline of how you're related to the person. And all I ask in return is that you care for the photo. And if you're not interested in family history, please gift it to a relative who is. And I'd say about 30% of the time, I get an email or a phone call even. I've even gotten a couple of little gifts mailed to me. Somebody sent me a little scarf. Somebody else sent me a little book of poems that had been written by their ancestor. And I don't want to creep people out. So that's why I put that information in the letter. But people are truly shocked. I mean, these people that are very happy to get the photos will say, I can't believe that you found me. And they couldn't believe how easy it was for me to accomplish that. So, in terms of privacy, nobody has the privacy that they think. It is very, very difficult to stay totally under the radar. If maybe you've only rented your whole life, you don't vote. And I don't know what databases they put in there, but if you don't own anything and you don't vote, no credit card information is in there. Maybe you could stay under the radar, but otherwise forget it. But all your relatives have to not do those things either, because you'll show up as a connection to them. Exactly. So it's kind of a scary world. And when you add AI into the mix, AI can't go behind subscription walls, but I'm sure it scrapes public databases. There's nothing there to stop it.
and there's a lot of money to be derived
Mhm.
from those databases and data brokers.
Yes.
How would you square the challenge of on one side wanting to protect your privacy as a living, breathing, active person who may even have very important reasons to stay away, to not be found, a stalker, for example.
Mhm.
How do you manage that while at the same time being a good ancestor and providing things for future researchers to find after you're gone?
I don't think you can hide. I think the horse left the barn a long time ago. The only possible way is if you go into witness protection and or you legally change your name and wipe your records. I mean, my high school yearbook photo is available on Ancestry.
Yeah.
My marriage record is available on Ancestry. My son's birth information is available on Ancestry. California sold to the devil a long time ago. I don't think you can hide from it.
Though, from a technical perspective, if I might raise, I think there's layers here. You are speaking from the perspective of trying to find somebody.
Mhm.
If somebody introduces me to somebody else, and I just recently was going to reach out and send an email, a cold email to them because they didn't know. I didn't get a warm intro, just check to this person and tell them I said so. Um, and I wanted to check them out before I do that. What's the context of the email that I write? And so I am accustomed to doing this kind of a search. It seems to me not a bad thing to do. It's just actually a decent thing to do.
Mhm.
Um, but the flip side is also true. There's a lot of reasons why you want to hide the trail that you're generating every single day, the digital uh, effluence of every task that we take, because you don't want to be annoyed by those phone calls. You don't
Mhm.
want to be giving that data away. Um, uh, that's kind of a different question, isn't it?
It is.
Mhm.
And again, I think it's extremely difficult to hide. We get probably at least a half a dozen spam calls per day. Now and then, if I want to play with them, I'll pick it up. They always know who we are because they'll say, "Hello, Dave," or "Hello, Linda. I'm so and so," and they're not really. I know that. But I don't think it's possible to hide. I said, literally, I think you'd have to have a name change. If your name is John Smith or Mary Jones,
Mm.
maybe you have a possibility that somebody's going to have to do a lot of work to find you, or if you live in a big city like New York or LA, Chicago. But if you're living in the suburbs and your name it doesn't even have to be as unusual as Stufflebean. I found people with pretty common surnames, but they're not living in big cities. And I had just enough information from an obituary, usually somebody they're related to, where when I look in these public databases online, oh yeah, this is the person I want because in the list of possible relatives are 3 people that were in that obituary. I
Which you told me a great story about your was it your high school
High
reunion?
school, yes. We have 425 people in my graduating class of 1970. And right when COVID hit, we were supposed to have our 50th reunion, got postponed for a year. But there was a group of us on Facebook, and I joined the group, and they were trying to locate 23 missing members. And they had been looking for a while. They didn't really, I think a couple of them knew what they were doing, but most of them were just trying to kind of Google and see if a name came up or something. And I said, well, I'm pretty good at finding people. I'll help you out. And a couple of weeks later, we'd found all 23 of them, including the 2 or 3 that unfortunately had passed away. And one of them was living like in the boonies of West Virginia. I looked on a map and it's like in the middle of nowhere, but I found her with her
So
married name, which I
there's
found online.
I think there's a lesson here also about a whole potential detective series about the genealogist as
Mhm.
detective.
I agree.
Speaking of fiction and writing and nonfiction, Annette, do you care to chime in here into the challenges of both privacy of daily life, and then also how you're weaving that into the realities of writing, where some of the people may very well still be alive, and even stories about compromising stories about that someone else may not know about, those that are past or even recently passed.
All right. So first of all, no, I'm scared. Linda scared me.
Scared too.
Yeah.
There's no hiding. Not that I thought there was, but that's food for thought. Anyway, so I would say that one of the number one concerns, I teach memoir writing, and one of the big concerns, if not the biggest, that people who come to my workshop is writing about others. How will other people in my stories react? And that's a genuine concern. So, and I've thought a lot about that. I've had my own experiences, so I'm going to share a little bit about that. So, first of all, I think a lot of people are worried about being sued. That is actually a minor concern as far as I know, and have seen. That really does not happen, unless you are talking about a famous person. Then and you're saying something that's not right, then you could get a lawsuit. But dead people can sue you, so that's number one. So, of course, writing about dead people doesn't mean it's sort of a free for all, because as Barbara rightfully mentioned, those dead people have descendants. Quite often, or even if they don't have direct descendants, there might be someone in the family who cares about the legacy and what's said about them. So I think whenever we talk about real people, we have to be genuine. But my advice is always write first, worry later, because first of all, you have to develop your own story. You have to see where you're at and be happy with it, and then you can move from there. One thing I have learned in my own experience, and I've seen it with other people, is you can never predict how people will react. When you give them your manuscripts, they might get upset about the littlest tidbit that you never gave a thought of. And the big embarrassing thing that you are like wrenchingly worried about goes by in flying colors. So there are plenty of stories like that. The other thing is that, and I think that's sort of been my mantra, most living people like being written about. And if you think about it, if you get your child's newsletter from school, as an example, the first thing you're going to do is like check if your kid is in there, right? Or if there's a class photo, you're going to check, do I see myself, right? And you don't care that much. If you're not there, who cares? If your kid's not there, right? So most people, and it's a validation, it's an affirmation that we matter. And my kids, when I was writing, when I started out writing, and they were pretty little, and I had published something, and some of them were parenting stories, they caught wind of that, and they'd be like, so am I in it? Am I in it? And if they weren't in it, didn't care. So that's something I think to keep in mind, that it's not just a minefield fraught with problems. It's actually, most people like being written about. So it's actually a nice thing to do. The other thing that I have found is that reactions are very indicative of the relationship you have with the people you're writing about. So if you have a good relationship, an easygoing relationship with someone, your relationship most likely will deepen through your writing, because they will get to know you. They will react to what you've written. If you have a bad relationship with someone, writing about them is not going to help. That's definitely not. And there are some famous stories about, father-son relationships that have been patched up and then blew apart because the son wrote about the mother. Not even the father, but he wrote about the mother. The other thing that I always emphasize, in my view, people's lives are more important than your writing. So, and the story that you think is important to put out there. So I personally think it's not worth destroying a relationship for the sake of putting a story out there. It's just not. The other thing to consider is that telling all and telling nothing are not the only options. So I'll give you guys an example. One of my students was writing about her son who fell ill with leukemia when he was 13. He ended up dying, but she was writing the story of a mother with a very, very sick child. At the same time, however, she was getting divorced from her husband or was already estranged, right? So there's this whole other complicated thing. And because it was not that easy of a divorce, right? She didn't really want the divorce in that story. And she managed to control the text to keep it focused on the kid, still bring the father in, because every reader is going to be like, where's the father? Who's the father? You got to explain what's going on, right? But you have to sort of keep the focus on what you want to write about, explain a little bit about the background. And sometimes you can even come out saying, I don't want to write about my ex-husband because I don't want to write about it. And most readers, if you're upfront, will be fine with that. The other thing that I think is really important, and that takes some craft, particularly with family members, is to learn how to write the people in your life as a character, not just as your mom, your uncle, your son, but who are they? Who were they? Particularly if you're writing about time in their life that you maybe weren't around for. Like my siblings and I are currently digging into our dad's life, and he left a lot of stuff from before he even was a father, when he was a student at Purdue, when he traveled the country. And it's kind of fun, to be like, who was this guy before he was our dad, right? And most people, if you really put some effort into that, really appreciate that. If you achieve sort of a full portrait of them as a whole person, not just as my mom, my dad, my brother, etc. And last thing I want to bring up, and then we can wrap up my chapter, and I'm happy to answer questions, is that when you write about somebody, or a family member, or it's a group thing or whatever, don't put it out there. Don't put it in front of anyone until you are happy with it. And that means that it's 100% what you're comfortable saying. If there's anything where you're like, maybe I shouldn't mention that, don't. It'll blow up, right? So just put out there what you can stand behind, and then still, I have the rule for myself, and it served me very well. When I write about someone real, I always let them read what I'm going to put out there. I don't want the people in my life to be blindsided. I'm willing often to change something. And also, to be on the positive side, family members are great fact checkers. Yeah. I mean, I've had some of my own memories of my father's death, for instance, really reshuffled, because turns out my memory was wrong. Yeah. So those are things I wanted to bring up.
Yeah. As you talk about, or maybe this is just, wrapping my own family into all of this, as I think about family history, storytelling, I generally am thinking about history, and I'm thinking about, my parents and beyond. Even thinking about my parents, I have my siblings and their children that are all part of that story. How do you work through a story like that while preserving not just the privacy of living people, but even ordinary references that may be completely innocuous to you, like where they work, or what a boss who comes in and has some outrage and then fires them because of something, and that becomes a part of your story. I'm making it up, obviously. How do you handle those kinds of things? Is that part of the developing the character?
I think that's really part of text management. So I would be, for instance, the boss. I never disclose bosses' names or company names. Okay. So I would put, like, even when my own boss shows up in my one of my bosses shows up in my memoir, Jumping Over Shadows, I called him Mr. F. And I never mentioned the company itself or where exactly it was located, because that was also immaterial to the story. You know, I gave characteristics about him because that was material to the story, but you know, the actual company and his name and all that wasn't. So I think there are ways to, you know, now if someone, Linda scared me, right? If someone really wanted to dig into my employment history, who knows? You know, they could figure that out. But like, really, like, who's good? Like, who cares? You know, who I worked for in the late 1980s, like.
Which I love this comparison, frankly, because there is the question of text management and developing a portrait and the logic of a story that's so important in how you are telling it. And then on the other hand, I'm looking at the facts of a life that I want to document. The way, being the nerd that I am, I'm always looking at it saying, okay, just because you collect the facts doesn't mean you have to tell the world, right? I mean, there's
Exactly.
things that goes into my facts list, and it does matter that it was Mr. Finkelstein or Mr. Fiedler or Mr. Fujimoto. Those might be relevant to the continuity of fact. So yeah, I can't accept that as as part of my collection of facts. And how do you, Linda, work in memoir and family storytelling that is story first? How do you look at that in terms of the genealogical work that you're doing for non-living people?
Well, for the living people, when I'm writing on my blog, my husband doesn't care if I call him Dave, so that's not a problem. I don't, I mean, my son doesn't really care either, but you know, he's a lot younger, not retired. And so I just say my son. If I'm writing about a sibling, and my sibling is one who really is under the internet radar. So I don't even say if it's a sister or a brother. The very, very few times I would mention the immediate family unit, I would just say my sibling or my cousin. But once you get beyond that, and those people are gone, I mean, I have no problem relating all the facts of their lives. I mean,
Yeah.
my husband's great-great-grandfather was a true black sheep. Okay, he actually that whole cluster family was a black sheep family between his great-great-grandfather, great-great-grandmother, and two of their children. They had 14 marriages between them, and I never found divorce records for any of them except one.
Woo!
And my great-great-grandfather just kind of wandered around through the Ozarks, Arkansas and Missouri, causing mayhem here and there. And the people that he actually, I met one of his granddaughters who was elderly when I met her. He died in 1909, and this was back in the early 90s. She remembered him as a very young girl. She remembered him as a mean old man. Nobody cared what I said about him. You know, it was far enough removed that it didn't matter what the facts were or what I was going to say. Nobody cared. And the one person that sort of remembered him didn't care either because he was mean to her.
But that's in terms of caring. Then to put your genealogical hat on, you do care about whether those facts are right, right?
Yes, yes.
It's a feelings thing. It's
Yes.
like not worrying about injuring them. Yeah,
But
yeah.
if it was, when I write my stories that I publish online, I leave out, I purposely omit facts about living people.
Yeah.
I might talk about growing up on Lake Winnipesaukee in New Hampshire, or, you know, when I went to Mexico and lived for a year or whatever. But I would not mention any of the other people that I had interactions with. I might say there were two kids that were in the camp next door, and I played with them all the time. Or my roommates and I in Mexico City, you know, took an extra trip here, and you know, we did these kinds of things. But I once you get to the beyond the grandparents, I don't worry about the facts that are in there.
Yeah,
I mean,
because
I
a
told
casual mention of that friend who was with you in that camp
yes,
might materially affect their lives, even if you haven't been talking to them for
right,
decades. You just don't know. Yeah, especially with
decade,
those unusual names.
half a century. But
Yeah,
no,
no,
you don't know.
you don't know.
My husband's grandmother had a friend named Nadine, and she was actually murdered when she was riding in a car. She was only 19 years old. This was in Oklahoma in the early years of statehood, but she doesn't have any descendants. She was riding with friends, and some kids went joyriding past them. You think it could have been happening in 2020, not in 1920. But for fun, they just started firing and happened to hit her in the neck and killed her. They fired into the car as they drove by for no reason. It wasn't road rage or anything. They were just out joyriding and they had their guns.
Wow,
But
there's a story.
there's nobody
Yes.
in her, not even like great grand nieces and nephews that are around. We're seeing that story in one of my blog posts would make any difference to anybody.
Yeah, yeah, except it
So
might be a
I
compelling story.
I
Yeah.
do look at the bigger picture and what I'm going to tell, and I want to make sure that you can't easily trace something. When I write about all the old photos that I return to descendants, but I generally stop giving family information at least a couple of generations before that person that's going to get it. So if anyone wanted to use any of my old photos and try to find people, they would have to really go digging and know the ins and outs of finding those missing generations in there.
So that sounds like a perfect introduction for you, Kathy. So our very own Kathy
Well,
Stone, go ahead.
very interesting. And my first question, Linda, is are these pictures that were in your collection, or are you just
No.
you're finding lost photos, as we say?
I did have some in that I've inherited, and when I knew who they were and there was no connection to the family, then I would try to find descendants and I mailed those off. But I enjoy doing that, and so
Yep.
now I troll online websites. There really aren't any antique stores in Tucson that have old vintage photos sitting around. I've learned that, so I look for them online cheap. And if
I'll
I
have to
find a
send you
descendant,
some.
I'll have to send you some.
if I find a descendant, I buy the picture and off it goes in the mail when I get it.
That's great. I love that. I was just curious with these photos if that was, I thought that's what you were doing, but I wanted to make sure.
Yes.
So, and I guess my perspective is a bit different coming from that of a person who was a photo manager. I'm trying to retire now, still finishing that up, and working with clients and also now working with my own photos in terms of what is shared and where it is shared. And that to me is the most important thing because, and I've worked with some people that probably you'd not recognize their names, but people who live where I do will. And so one of my clients had a non-disclosure agreement because they were that concerned about anything. They have no social media presence. You could find them very easy because they're well known in the city, and I respected that. Like their stuff, it's totally private. Another one of my clients, they gave me permission. The project I'm still trying to finish. They're very generous to me when it's taken me so long to get this job done, but they allowed me to share some of the information and things on that project in one of the courses I taught for the photo managers on working with large photos and memorabilia. But I think for me, it comes down to my client has shared stories with me that we did some recordings and interviews and things with her talking about some of her family members, some of which I will share to the whole family, and some of which I won't because she would sometimes she'd get talking, and sadly, my client now has developed dementia, and so this was before we were sure that. So it's like, do these stories, and I've shared them with her daughter, but do these stories need to be told to the entire family? And I don't. And so, to me, that's the decision of her immediate descendants that to whether or not to tell these stories. On the other hand, this particular client collection, my client's mother and her grandmother both wrote books about their lives, and they're both in the Internet Archive. So anything that's described in those stories is now public knowledge and fair game to talk about. But it's the parts that aren't necessarily that were, because I look at that as that was a private conversation with me, and it was an offshoot of a conversation where we started off tell me about your cousins in this picture. And because here's a picture of you all at the beach somewhere in Oklahoma or somewhere having a great time. Tell me about each of your cousins. And it evolved into something totally different that wasn't even that photo or that topic. And you're nodding, Annette. I'm sure you're familiar with this when you interview people to do memoirs and things. And so it's like, to me, it wasn't not necessarily something that I will put in. I will edit that out of that recording, because my goal in getting the recordings was to add some information to the photos and also to give the family recording of her speaking, because that to me is, again, a priceless artifact. But I think it's, I know, Barbara, at one point we talked about who needs to hear it and when do they need to hear it in terms of things. And I have something that about a family member of mine that has been posted in Family Search. And it's a fact. It is a fact. But it's only one generation removed from me. It's not me, but right up ahead of me. And it's a fact that I know that person did not want anybody to know. And so it was something in the public. But I know if that person was still living, they would be just beside themselves that that got put somewhere publicly. And that's what I always try to keep in mind, is who needs to know that? And in this particular case, and I've rolled this over in my mind many, many times, is, does this add a whole lot to any of the story we're trying to tell? And my conclusion is it doesn't really. There may be a whole story there, but the mere publicizing the fact doesn't tell the story anyway, and nobody's around that can actually tell the story anymore. So I'm like, I don't know if we need to share everything, or if even if things people, if the people are gone. And again, we've got that. And again, I love obituaries, because that's where we find half of our all of our family information, almost, as photo organizers. This current client, we found first it was just a box, like a shoe box full of obits. And it was like my client's daughter works with me, and she says, I said, what is this? And she goes, oh, it's the box of the dead. I went, yep, that's exactly what it is. And then later on we found, oh no, it was a book. It was a diary with them all slided. Later on we found the box with even more. But it was incredibly valuable because it was facts, and it gave us areas to figure out who was this person, and somebody we didn't know anything about who their brothers and sisters were. We figured it all out through those obituaries. But again, it's minor information that is factual. So I guess it's just a matter for me of, what does the person want? And again, when they're gone, it's hard to know hard for anybody to say whether they wanted that shared or not. And if somebody decides to write their own memoir or book, then that's, to me, that becomes public fact. But it's sort of, what do we share in public? And are there stories that are for family only? That's, I guess, another side of it. Is there things that we do want the family to share, but don't necessarily need the whole world to know about? And I think that's something we've talked about, Barbara, in terms of what are the stories you sit around and tell now on Zoom, in the old days in the living room, versus what would you share at a town hall meeting? And just keeping a perspective on those kind of things. And it is a bit different, because I'm not trying to, now setting aside my own family, I'm working on my own family stuff. That's a whole different thing now, to try and figure all that part out. But in terms of working with other family, organizing their photos and all the memorabilia, and we're trying to preserve whatever stories we can find out and whatever information we track down. And as you know, when you're looking through stuff, I started writing dates and things on a piece of paper, and eventually this was crazy, because I'm constantly ruffling through that paper to say, who was this person? So we ended up pasting paper all over the walls with a big the old-fashioned kind of a family tree and a relevant dates, because these people moved a lot. And so it was like, where were they living then? And does this make sense that this was part of that? But I don't know how much of that they're even going to share in the family legacy that it'll be shared with all kinds of distant family members. And granted, anybody could take anything out of there and make it public. Like, there's nothing to stop them. It's not, as you say, like, once you make something public, particularly in the digital age, you can't stop it anymore. You can't pull it back. But where I think it becomes important to think about what do we want to put in and what do we not want to put in? Barbara
In-
just reached for something to hold up. I can tell. I read the clues now.
Okay, for one thing, I found Annette's book. And it was right next to my grandmother's book. And what I was thinking about, Kathy, as you say that, is how what we're talking about right now is so different from 50 years ago when your, high school yearbooks were put together, when mine too, come to think of it, or or 100 years ago. This was 1948 for my grandmother's book. They could not even fathom what we can know and what we can publish. And the idea of publishing then meant everything from typesetting and galleys, um, uh, that we can do in a 30-second clip. So the notion of what you publish, and then once published, it's everywhere, you can't take back what you've published, is so completely different that it really does behoove us to stop and really think these things through. When my mom passed during the pandemic, after 8 years of slowly disappearing, if I can say, from dementia, disappearing in the sense of her online engagement with others, her in-person engagement with others, and letters, and the liveliness that she lived her life. Um, I chose not to do an obituary. That was an intentional decision. And part of that was a reflection on the notion that, they didn't always do obituaries. Obituaries are an artifact of a business model of newspapers that has changed, certainly from where it was when her grandparents were born. My great grandfather, her grandfather, was a newspaper publisher. And it there she knew no one here. She'd been here all these years and didn't know anybody locally. There was a mandated settlement of probate and so on, which appeared in a paper, which, by golly, some genealogist someday will find. But short of that, um, instead, I wrote a posts. We had a Zoom event. I recorded the Zoom event. We presented my sister, was an artist, and her husband, a filmmaker, put together a remarkable video. None of that is published. All of that is private. And we've kept all of that private and treasured as digital assets, digital artifacts. And I don't know, in my heart of hearts, there is a responsibility to retain and maintain and carry forward these digital assets, is what they're called in business, these materials. And frankly, part of what we do here is to help others find ways to do that with their own stuff, because we're making it up. It's not the right way to do it. It hasn't been done. Our generation is figuring it out. And somebody's going to have somebody else is going to have another piece of software to figure out how to do this, but there's not going to be one answer. There's going to be principles. And that's what you're teaching here.
Well, I think what the other thing that struck me as you were speaking, Barbara, and about newspaper obituaries is, and I just stumbled on this yesterday in my endless quest to rename all these files we've scanned. And the grandmother's book, my client's grandmother's book, is they have in their collection. It's written on legal, the old yellow legal pads. She wrote the whole thing out by hand. And there's a typed copy. So the handwritten one is there, and this is my inner fascination with history flying out of there of these objects. Then there's a typed one, which somebody Xeroxed, and it's got crooked pages and stuff. And then they do have one copy of the book, but then the book's on the Internet Archive now, which to me is a benefit because it's out of print. We're never going to get another one. And now we can refer people who want to read her book back to that. And even my client's grandmother, my client's mother who wrote the book, she wrote with a writer, much like you, Annette, where she wrote with someone to write the memoir for her. So her initial, like the drafts of it are all typewritten, nothing written by hand. And I'm thinking my client was originally, she was thinking that she should write a book because her grandmother did and her mother did. And she was thinking, I must carry on the tradition and write a book. But she didn't really want to. Like, she didn't have any desire to do it. And I said, well, this will be your contribution. You've spent a lot of time and money to get all these photos that everybody collected back to 1800s and everything else, all organized and put together to carry on for the family. And whether it becomes public or not, that's something the family can decide. Like my client could have thought about that down the road had sadly had the dementia not reared its ugly head as it tends to do. But it's a part of the and again, the other example that occurred to me, Barbara, is which I talked to with our mission genealogy colleagues on this, is one of the things in their collection. So he would be my client's grandfather. He was a Presbyterian minister all over the southern U.S. This family, even though they ended up here in Calgary, their roots are all different places all over the States. And so the preacher, as they referred to him, not by his name, he was called Preacher. Anything written that refers to the preacher. He kept these incredible books called Pastor's Records. There's 3 volumes of it. In these books, they're about this big, is written every single sermon he delivered and where he was. And even he even commented on whether it was well received or not, which was quite cute.
5-star rating.
Yes, the old rating system. Every wedding he performed, every christening he performed, and every funeral he performed are all in these books. So from hanging around with genealogists, I now see the value of these books for people who are trying to find ancestors and information on them. And we are, in fact, have decided to donate them somewhere in the States, because for anyone here, they really have no relevance. Like, those people don't live here. They have, like, the chances of finding anyone in those records that's still relevant to their family, because for the most part, it wasn't family members anyway. So we're looking of a place to donate them to. But then I go back and I think well, they're all dead now, so doesn't matter. But that's some of that information that's personal information of all those people in those books too. Mm-hmm. So I wander back and forth between how much do you disclose of people who don't have any control over it anymore? Like, he's gone. His, all of the family, well, no, I think there's a couple of cousins still alive, but his daughter is gone. All of her siblings are gone. We're down to this next generation. So, and it's easy to make that decision because my client's daughter is a friend of mine, and she's going to get all this stuff. And there's a lot of stuff. There's like rooms in the house full of stuff. I showed Barbara a few pictures the other day as a justification of why this has taken me so long. But and so she can't keep all this stuff. Like the house that my client's parents lived in was a large home, and there was lots of room in it. And my client bought it when they passed away. And it's just basically people picked over what they wanted for their memoirs for the family. And the rest of it's just this pile of stuff. And it's beyond, so it's something has to be done with the physical too. And we've talked a lot about that in other sessions about preserving and photographing it. But then it's also trying to find somewhere where you're putting it somewhere where it has some relevance to somebody that the grandfather, no, my client's dad, sorry, I keep mixing up with my friend. My client's father was in the oil, he's a geophysicist in the oil industry, and he started a golf tournament here in Calgary he came here in 49, so early 1950s. And the golf tournament is still going on today. And they had in the house were hats, beer mugs, little things you stuck on your golf cart, and towels from every year, not to mention trophies, towels from every single year of that golf tournament that still goes on today. And it's like, what do you do with it? And there's certainly not private in that, other than the trophies all have people's names on them. So it's a question again of where do you just put it in the thrift store or
There's a fine line of editing,
yeah.
it's a reminder of how, as you're talking about Annette, in terms of crafting a story by craft, it's as much about what you take out as what you leave
Yes.
in. And
Yeah,
I'm
for sure.
thinking of, an artist's appreciation of something. It's not about the hand, it's about the eye. It's not about the carving the marble, it's about what you take away to reveal the thing that was there all along. And there's always going to be a shame in the parts that were thrown away, but you can't keep everything. And making space for new life involves a certain amount of decomposition of the other stuff that was there. And I think everyone who has ever cleaned out a parent's house appreciates the challenge of that. There is something to be said for Swedish death cleaning.
Well, and we carried on a bit of his story of this because of by all the trophies have been donated back to the golf tournament that's still going on today in 2027, 2026. But there were additional plaques placed on the bottom saying donated by to him
Yeah.
and what he had been given the trophy for, because they were all things that over various years. And this was a fun golf tournament. This wasn't like the British Open we were talking about here. This was a fun one, so you were getting them for longest drive, or
Yeah.
this was the oil
Funniest laugh.
patch. Least longest drive from somebody who'd had too many drinks or something. So
Yeah.
and they were hand sculpted. They're beautiful. They're not like like an old metal cup trophy. They were all hand sculpted a picture, like images of different people in the oil patch. So we managed to put a little bit of his story on there, and then we'll tell the rest of that story will get told in the family legacy and pictures of them. But
Kathy, I want to circle back to something you just casually inserted in there. And that was the notion that here's a woman whose mother and grandmother had taken the time to write the book, to write the family story. And then comes her time, and she feels bad that she didn't do this. And yet here you are, you helped her understand that by taking the time to archive and curate her collection, she is passing down a story in materials.
Yeah.
Now, that makes perfect sense to me, especially in a world, again, looking at where we are now and where we're going, what our kids will inherit, where any artifact could be not exactly photographed and not exactly reconstituted in from digital form, but certainly photographed to be remembered, and then thank you, kiss it goodbye. I mean, I really did clean my mom's house out. And how I think that's a terrific way to look at it. Because you're putting together pieces that someone else can then also build on to tell more stories. And I think that's really valuable.
Well, and my client, part of why she was too busy to write a book is for any of you familiar with Calgary Stampede, it's a massive big summer festival here in Calgary that's been going on since, I don't know, Linda could correct me if I'm wrong, since
Steer are involved.
early 1900s. And it's a big thing, and they have a volunteer organization called the Caravan. The Caravan go all over during Stampede Week. If you don't want to cook your own breakfast during Stampede, you don't need to. There are hundreds of pancake breakfasts going on in the city. And the organization of the Stampede Caravan, they have one every day during the 10 days of Stampede. They've gone all over the world. They've gone to like Olympics in different countries as representatives of the city. She volunteered on that committee. In 2020, she got her 50-year pin, which is tragic. One of these things had to happen during 2020. It was one of my few times I went out during 2020. But that's another piece of her story. It's also the other dilemma and where that story needs to be told. But there's just went through the amount of photos taken at those events of people mixing up pancakes and flipping pancakes and hitting people with their battered hands and things is phenomenal. And you don't need it all to tell the story. And it's so much stuff, it's hard to keep. But it's also and it translates in between being it, and it hits that area between public and private. These are her own private photos, but they were of public events. And so we had bad flooding here in 2013, and the place where the big arena here flooded, and a lot of the stuff that would have the records that the Calgary Stampede had got flooded out. So we've scanned them all. My client has financed that because a lot of police don't have money, but we're going to just give them all the photos and let them throw them away without worrying about private public in that regard. But it's something that you always have to have in the back of your mind is this something that when we're trying to disperse these things and again get the stories out, where's the line in between? There's lines in between, and there's stories in there that I wouldn't tell here, and I wouldn't put in with the Stampede either. But
it sounds to me as though in wrapping this up, you're really coming back to the gray areas,
yeah,
the gray
that's right.
areas in terms of what do you actually save, the gray areas of fact that make you decide whether, what it is that feels like a story, or the gray areas of what you disclose of fact that you actually can confirm. And I think that while, like engineering, there may be things that are, this is the way it is done, to do it perfectly and right, and not choosing to not do it perfectly means you're just being lazy. Well, actually, no. It's okay to curate. Nature curates for us. It lets those things that are left outside rot. It's okay. And
I think too, if we go with good intention, I think that goes a long way too. And if there's somebody left, so it's falling on my client's daughter to make these kind of decisions of what should be shared publicly and what should be reserved. But I think that's okay because there's nobody else to make those kind of decisions.
At the end of the day, we are always leaving it to the descendants.
Yeah.
Well, I think that as storytellers, we need to hope that each storyteller has a moral and ethical compass, and they think through the choices they make before it goes public. We've all kind of touched on, if they're family secrets and people don't want them told. Well, I don't think people in the past really had that much choice over keeping secrets. Maybe you could keep it from somebody in the family who didn't live near you, but look at the newspapers from 100 years ago, even 50 years ago, and the social columns. Every salacious bit of gossip was in the newspaper, on the front page with all the details. So-and-so was drunk and they went around shooting up everything and they killed somebody's animals on their ranch. So-and-so is getting a divorce. All these kind of things. And so stories that maybe our great-grandparents thought they took with them to their graves, either through newspapers and county histories and that sort of thing, matched with some peripheral family members that knew details and shared them and passed them on. Those stories aren't secret anymore. And then you throw DNA in the mix if you're trying to, if they're trying to hide, babies that were not who they said they were, parents who were not, who said they were. Today, we can kind of choose whether or not we want to share some of those details, but they didn't have any control back then. How would we know about all these stories today if they had any control and they could keep them secret? They would have been lost to time, and they're not.
Well, actually, I think you and Annette in particular are part of this teaching of the moral compass, of helping people and teaching in the form of appreciating the consequences and appreciating that both in terms of feelings and true destruction of families and those kinds of things that are a consequence of releasing information like that. We had 3 bombshells in my family alone. And they are known among family members. And yet finding ways to talk about them. Just because a fact is a fact doesn't mean it needs to be the headline. And it's not the headline of what people are and where they are and what that all means. I may need to talk to you about some research, though.
Yeah. Well, and something just occurred to me, Linda, as I was thinking about, you were talking about how you can find anyone, and there really anything that's facts out there. Is I was looking for researching something, and I found a newspaper article about myself, and I wasn't looking there. I was trying to find out when my stepmother passed away. And in that article, it was something about I debated in high school, and it was a little article on my partner and I debating, and named both of our sets of parents and our addresses were printed right in the newspaper. So it's like, okay, guess there was no privacy back then. So,
Wow.
Well,
yeah,
obituary.
I was kind of like, and I would have known it when it happened. Somewhere in these big bins behind me is probably that article. But when I saw it, I went, wow, I don't think you'd see that today.
Obituaries always listed the person's address.
Yeah.
They said, oh, you know, they suffered from cancer for 3 years and they died at this hospital. And
Yeah.
eventually they started taking the addresses out, not because they didn't want people to know where they lived, but because the nefarious people out there were looking to see what time the funeral was, and they'd go rob the house because they knew
Robbing
the
the
house
house. Yeah.
would be empty. So that's why that changed. But
Yeah.
I mean, everything was out there to be found in the papers. I said, even up until the 70s. I said, after the 70s, it kind of changed a little bit as we started getting towards computers.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But the
Well,
newspapers had less and less in them.
I think we're
Yeah.
going to be reflecting back on each of the stages in our own adult lives. I can certainly think of the 70s, the 80s, 90s, and so on, and how we have characterized the availability of information, never mind things like digital photos and the role of newspapers, and where people's experiences in local towns, symbol towns. This has been a fascinating discussion. I want to thank all of you for stepping in under a fairly quick time window. It's deeply appreciated and a wonderful reminder of your commitment to this community, your commitment to giving back and sharing these kinds of things that help us all with our moral compass, practical guidance, and inspiration to tell our stories, tell the people that we love, tell the people that matters to, and the people we don't know in the future that will benefit from this kind of information, these kinds of stories. With that, I'm going to
our own stories. We got
and
control.
telling our own stories too, and how we go about telling our own stories too. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and end this recording. And remember, all of you watching this, you're welcome to add to the comment. And we're going to have a little sidebar here after the recording ends. So thank you again.
Thank you.